Good morning everyone and welcome to today's APM webinar, Turning Around the Performance of Major and Mega Projects with our guest speaker Vip Vyas from Distinctive Performance. My name is Robert Allen and I'm the APM Branches Manager and I'll be your host today. It's great to see so many people join us today and I hope this finds you all well. Please be aware that this webinar is being recorded and all attendees are currently in mute mode. That's not to say that we don't want you to get involved in today's webinar. There'll be a poll during the presentation, but also you'll find a questions function within your toolbar. Vip is more than happy to answer questions at the end, so please submit your questions during the presentation and we'll try our best to answer as many as possible. This session will count towards your CPD and should last no more than an hour. I would personally like to thank the volunteers of the APM branches and SIGs for all their continued efforts with making these webinars happen. So, let's move over to Vip. Vip is acclaimed for advising and partnering with boards and senior management teams to catalyse rapid shifts in the performance of their business and projects. Vip has over 20 years of international experience working with major and mega projects teams in sectors as diverse as oil, gas, mining, power, complex infrastructures and technology. So on that note, and with no further ado, I'll pass over to Vip.
Great, thanks Rob, and welcome everyone. Rob, I've got this start broadcast. Should I just hit that button?
No, you're okay. We're good.
We're good to go. Okay, great. Okay, so welcome everyone, and I think to start this session, why don't we get a feel for the different disciplines that are present on the webinar. So, Rob, do you want to start off by just issuing the first poll?
It's currently live for people to join in.
Yeah, that's great. And from what I can see, Rob, we've got about 50% of the attendees are project directors and project managers, and the other 50 are contract managers.
That's correct.
That's great. And then I appreciate we've still got people joining in the background. Could you also run the second poll, which is how many of the attendees are actually currently working on a project? And if they look at their project, they're actually, part of what they're working on is actually turning around the performance of the project. So if we could just run the second poll.
Yes, certainly. We'll give people a little bit longer to fill this one in, but at the minute we're around the 70% for the yeses, 20% for the no, and 10 or 11% for not working on a project at the moment.
Okay, so I think given that that distribution, this is a really relevant session, huh?
Certainly is.
Yeah.
So we'll give a couple.
So okay. Yeah, sure.
And there we go. So yeah, roughly 60% are currently working. So I'll hide this and we can continue your presentation, Vip.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thanks very much, Rob. Okay, so let me just continue. I mean, Rob's already so I'll skip through the slide. Just probably a couple of points to add. A lot of what I do, apart from webinars, I lead a lot of conferences. I describe myself as a pracademic. And what I mean by pracademic is basically I spend about 85% of my time working with organizations and projects, and about 15% of my time writing. So I love writing. I write for some of the top business schools, and I'm also currently writing a mega projects book, which will be released later on this year. Some of the materials that some of the content that you see in this session, I'll have in the book itself. So, anyway, having said that, in terms of just my projects experience, probably a couple of things to highlight. I know, again, Rob's covered this. I initially started over 20 years ago in the oil and gas space. So I was based out in the UK, worked a lot with BP, Chevron, Qatargas in the Middle East, and I got involved with projects, everything from sort of upstream, large-scale midstream, and also downstream refineries, eventually getting into petrochemicals as well. So been involved with many projects like that. I moved over to Asia about 10 years ago, and given that Hong Kong isn't exactly an oil and gas hub, I started getting involved regionally, including Australia, on a number of large power plant projects, mining, both gold and copper. And then you can see, as you can see there, a whole range of infrastructure projects, which I won't go into all the details. I think they're pretty well laid out there. And then just very quickly, a bit of background about the company itself. Basically, Distinctive Performance works with organizations and mega projects, and the work is very much about impacting the future of those operations. And today, I'm really just going to focus on projects. So if we look at this whole, the focus of this session is about a couple of key words, and the key words are turning around performance. So when we look at turning around performance, what does that actually mean? Well, when we look at performance, visually, you can think of it that it looks a little bit like this, okay? So this performance indicator on the left, you can apply anything to that. It could be, if you're in engineering, it could be the volume of documentation that's coming out. If it's a case of, it could be production rate on site. So it could be any indicator. This is purely illustrative. So when we're talking about turning around performance, we're looking at going from here to here. And what I mean by that is literally a large shift in performance over a short period of time. So that's what I mean by turning around performance. And when we're talking about major and mega projects, what we're really talking about is trying to do that in a sizable system. So this is the sort of the area, this is the challenge that I've been interested in for over 20 years now. And when we started to look at this, over 20 years ago, when we started to look at this sort of shift from down here to up here, the way we sort of looked at this was to say, actually, if you're trying to do that on a project, what you're really doing is altering the entire reality of the project or the organization. So another way you could describe it is that we're getting into this area of business as not normal. And one of the things I do when I look at this gap from a project delivery perspective is I ask a provocative question especially of project managers and project directors. And the question goes as follows, which is, how come as a project director, you're paid so much more money than the workers who are actually doing the work itself? And when I put that conversation into the room, I often get very interesting responses. And the responses range from things like, well, I'm obviously being paid for my experience, or I'm being paid for my network of connections. But when you look at it from a project perspective, that's really not where the payment happens. The premiums are literally down to you having to do what this man does. So if you look at James Bond, what does James Bond do? Well, what James Bond does is that James Bond gets put into some situation and he's got to make something happen that wasn't going to happen. In other words, the premium, the pricing, the extra salary is about impacting the predictable future. So you can think of this as a sort of an operational definition of leadership. So when we talk about this turning project around, what we're really talking about is a shift in reality, and the project leadership team has a big say in that. So if we just build on this idea of shifting reality, let's sort of look at what's happening at the industry level. So what we've got here is a lot of data from the World Economic Forum. I'm not planning to go through every single element of this, obviously, because we could probably just spend the whole presentation on one slide. But I wanted to pick out certain trends that are happening out there in the industry. So one thing that's there at the moment is an enormous financing gap. So when we look at global infrastructure, there's a huge sort of gap between the number of projects and the financing. So there's if you like, a shift in reality at the industry level where we need to address the financing piece. The second is the urbanization crisis. So if you look at some countries, take for example the United States, there's just a massive gap between what's needed and what's currently supplied. And probably the third piece I wanted to highlight, and this is probably something that you are familiar with, it's the productivity challenge. So when we look at how productivity has improved in infrastructure in particular, you can see that there has, if you compare it to other sectors, it's actually been fairly static. So these are sort of like the three reality shifts that, if you like, the infrastructure sector is facing. And this is if you like at the industry level. But if we go from the sort of like the 1,000-foot view to the 10-foot view of projects, then projects look a little bit like this. So from my experience is that projects have a tendency to follow a certain storyline. And the storyline starts off with what I call the honeymoon period. So this is at the beginning of the project where people are excited, they love the visuals, they look out into the future, and they're really, really proud of what they're about to engage in. But very shortly, you go from this kind of honeymoon period into hitting reality. And the reality looks like this. So when you look at the reality of most projects, statistically, what you find is that a lot of them crash. And if you're an investor, it's a very interesting conversation to look at, which is, why would you invest in something that crashed 70% of the time? So when you're looking at this kind of reality that we're having to deal with, this reality is backed up by statistics. So what I've got here is a very small snapshot of a survey that was conducted by Vip Vyas. I think many of you are pretty familiar with Bent's work. He's a chair professor at the Said Business School. He's done a lot of research. And what you've got here is is a couple of sectors, but the findings he's found on these sectors, you can pretty much apply to, nuclear, technology, whatever else. So there's, and the main thing here that I wanted to point out are these cost overruns and also the massive standard deviations you get. So both of these two features of projects most people are familiar with, but I wanted to sort of map out this sort of performance map that we're having to deal with over and over again. So when you sort of step from the sort of the high level and then sort of look at, okay, what's behind the statistics? So when we start to look at what's behind the statistics, what I've got up here is basically a structure that I think most of you would be familiar with. These are the major phases that a project goes through from start to commissioning and handover. And what we're saying here, not surprisingly, is that you've got to focus on two things. One is setting up the projects right. And when you look at the whole area of setting up projects right, that covers things like optimism bias. Are we all the estimates that we're working with, do they seem realistic? Are we using reference class forecasting to benchmark our new project against other, a database of other ones that may be similar? Are we using data-driven decision making? Are we using an effective procurement approach? Is the philosophy right? So this all constitutes what I would call the upfront setting up right. And then you've got what I would call the delivery phase. And this covers things like making sure that the startup is effective and optimized. And during that startup, roles and accountability are really clear. The interfaces are mapped out. We know what we're doing. And not only do we know from a task perspective, what we're doing, but we've also got what I call distributed leadership. People with the right capabilities really stretched across all the organization charts, all the way from the client end through the subcontractors and down to the workforce. So we've got this sort of, we've got these two pieces, the front end and then the back end. And given this is, if you like, the theoretical perspective, one of the questions I had in the survey that you filled out, and by the way, thank you very much for filling out that survey. We had 73 people who took the time to answer all the questions. And what I'm pulling out here is literally your experience. What are you saying about what you witnessed, what you're witnessing on projects? And it's pretty interesting. So what you can see here is the orange bar charts that are the top 5 issues that you felt were most present on projects and most sort of undermined projects and had the biggest negative impact. So what you can see here is one of the first things that jumps out is poor project governance. So you're really saying that that's one big area that impacts project performance. But if you look at the peak, the highest one is scope changes. So scope changes and the weak business case and poor estimates, these are sort of two things that jumped out. The other two things that jumped out were the performance of subcontractors, which is what we've got here at 2.68. And the other equivalent issue that also jumped out was the project culture and the project capability. So what you're saying basically is when we look at that previous diagram, some of the hot areas are around project governance, around the initial business case, the scope changes, the quality of the subcontractors, and the overall project culture and project capability. So if we just build on this, so if we look at that sort of like the map of what we're dealing with, the title of this presentation was Turning Around a Project, right? So when we look at turning around a project, what's actually involved? What does that actually mean? So when we're looking at turning around projects, what we're really dealing with is this. We're dealing with this gap, okay? In particular, what we're looking at is, okay, we've got this gap. We want the performance to be up here, and the reality is our performance is down here. So what is the nature of this gap? What's actually going on, and how do we address it? So when we look at that question, what we're really doing is looking at this whole idea of altering the reality of a project. So when we start looking at this question of altering the reality, the first question is, okay, reality sounds good, okay, altering the reality, but what does it mean? So the way we've sort of the way we've looked at this whole idea of altering reality is to dissect reality into a number of components. So the one question that we've been asking is, okay, when you're talking about the reality, well, who are we talking about? So you find in some organizations and some projects, it's literally one person that dictates the whole environment. You know, we've come across projects and organizations where that person walks into the room and the whole mood shifts. So some projects you find the biggest constraint is one individual. And then there are other projects you go into, and what we found is that sometimes the top leadership team it's actually very keen on trying to create a shift in performance, but you find that there's more of a systemic issue. In some cases, it's the top leadership's direct reports that are kind of resistant. So you're dealing with more of a systemic issue at the collective level. So the first question is, who are the people, and identifying who they are. Is it the individual, or is it more of a systemic issue? The second question that we're asking is, okay, so we've identified some of the people, but then if we look at altering the reality of the project, what are they doing? And when you ask this question about what people are doing, there's again two different dimensions to that. There's a dimension to people which is from the outside. And what I mean by that is that you literally walk onto a project site and you can observe them. It's the external behavioral side, literally how you can view their actions. So that's what I mean by the objective side of the project. But as we all know, people have two sides. It's not just the external side. People also have an inside to them. And the inside to them is made up of our mindsets, our points of view, our feelings towards things, our perceptions, and they also have a big play in the way a project functions. So if we put those two dimensions together, and we can actually sort of apply that to a real project. So what we've got here is a picture of a site, right? So and what I wanted to highlight here are all those dimensions I've just sort of put into place. So if you look at this project, this site, you've got the objective side of the project. So all those things that you typically measure. So, you probably measure the uptime of this equipment. You probably measure the head count. the safety statistics. So all of these things are, if you like, objective, measurable items. But in addition to those, objective things, you've also got the internal aspects of the project. So, for instance, if you take these three guys at the back, the type of mindset they have, the conversations they're having could have a huge bearing on the project. So if I take, for example, parts of Asia over the last 5 to 10 years, there's been huge volumes of work. So if these three guys are having a conversation, and what they're literally saying is, listen, I think there's another job on the other side of the fence, and the contractors there are really desperate for people. So if we jump ship, and I think we could almost double our salary in doing that, if they're having that kind of dialogue, clearly that's going to have an impact on this project. On the other hand, if those three people are having a look at the other two people in the background, and they're saying, well, look, I've noticed we've had a lot of hand injuries over the last couple of weeks. Why don't we do a sort of a town hall talk and really get to the bottom of what's going on? That sort of, that kind of thinking and that kind of action and those kinds of behaviors will have a very different impact on the project. The other thing you can also see in the foreground is 6 people. And although we've got 6 people, you can also see only one person is doing some meaningful work. Now, it could be that they're actually doing some kind of investigation. That might be a legitimate reason why the others are looking at that person. But it could also be a reflection of this sort of pulsing, stop-start that's behind the Gantt chart. So this is sort of like a picture of what it looks like on a day-to-day basis on a project. So when it comes to the reality of any project, you can think of those 2 dimensions, the individual and collective, and subjective and objective. When you put them together, what you've got effectively is the skeleton of any enterprise or of any project. So you can see the skeleton is made up of people's intentions expressed as behaviors, the cultural dimension of the project. This also includes typically all the elephants in the room, things that people are thinking but they're afraid of saying, and what I call the coordinating systems of the project. So you can think of this as the skeleton of the major or mega project. And then if you put a bit of flesh onto it, it looks like this. And from our experience of working on many, many projects over a long period of time, what we found is that some of the quadrants which are the weakest, they're the ones that ultimately have the biggest constraints on the project. So for instance, you could have a very, very powerful safety system or a quality management system, but if the culture doesn't care, then that becomes the biggest constraint. Or on other projects, we've had situations where a new project director walks in, and what you find is that the rest of the project is trying to figure out what their thinking is, what their agenda is, and then they actually effectively adjust their behaviors to literally survive the new leadership that's come in. So when you're looking at turning around a project, one of the things you have to consider are all of these dimensions. Now, which is one thing that which is key. The other part of it is, of course, life doesn't present itself in these 4 quadrants. You're not, as a project director, you're not presented with things in these nice, neat packages. What you're actually presented with is all of these 4 quadrants put into a blender, and you're actually dealing with what this invisible, transparent circle represents, which is sort of all of it together in one go. And so when we're looking at turning around or really creating a significant shift in a project, what you're really looking at is impacting all these 4 areas at the same time. In other words, you're sort of looking at addressing and dealing with constraints very powerfully in all these 4 segments. So having said that, one thing I wanted to do was revisit one of the questions that we asked before, which is, and the question was, when it comes to turning around a project, what are the biggest and most significant factors that you have to deal with? And I gave you 2 options. One was technical and technical project issues. Was that the biggest constraint? And the second one was people capability and culture. And what you can see here from your response, the biggest challenge when it comes to turning projects around is the people side. The people's mindset, their capabilities, and the cultural part. Now, when you look at this, what's interesting about this is that when you look at the future performance of your project, what it really resides in is this area. It's really the capability of the leadership team to turn around, the mindset, the thinking. One way we can look at the future of the project is a function of all of the past experience, all the baggage, all the mindsets, all the trust issues, all of those things that get brought into the present moment. And all of that baggage that gets into the present moment, that is what effectively shapes or constrains and limits the quality of the conversations you have on the project. It colors the environmental space of the project, and then the actions which actually take that follow out of that.
Can you successfully turn around a project without replacing some of the key staff?
It's a very good question. I think, coming back to that, I think it's down to the willingness of people to examine their own mindsets. I think that is probably one of the biggest constraints, I would say. People are willing to look at that. I mean, if you take, for example, that Cathay Pacific project, there was a real willingness in the leadership team. They sensed that was one of the biggest constraints. So given that there was a willingness to look at it and a willingness to really take themselves on, that was probably one of the biggest contributors to that project being turned around. Very often you find when you come in from the outside, if the project leadership team is fixed, it's fixed on its point of view, and it's really in the midst of a quite a nasty blame game. The focus is very much on getting the claims sort of strategy in place. If you're playing that kind of game and there isn't really a willingness to step out of it, then in that kind of situation, maybe pulling out some people it could be the right decision. I generally don't like to pull people out because there's plenty of evidence to suggest that once you pull a project director out or some key members out, you're actually losing a lot of the intelligence that's been gathered over time. So what you effectively have is a situation where somebody new comes in, they've then got to relearn what's happening on the project, and of course that takes time, especially if it's a fairly large project. I've been on some projects where there's been 5 or 6 changes of project leadership, and I think it was quite counterproductive. I think it's better to try and work with who's there. But of course, it comes down to the willingness, Rob.
Lovely, thank you. So Albert's asked, what was the first change you made with the case study to improve performance?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing we did was we started off by doing a kind of a leadership review. So we sat down with each of the leaders from both the client side and the JV and also the material handling contractor. And we had one-on-one interviews, which were fairly confidential, but we pulled out a lot of the issues that were really at play. So I hope that helps in terms of putting a bit of structure to it.
Excellent. Thank you very much. There's definitely some great questions coming through linked to your case study. So Kev has asked, you talked about the 6 months schedule being behind. How much time was left to run on the schedule, and was it re-baselined after your team joined, or was it a recovery to the original previous project baseline?
Yeah, it was actually a recovery to the previous base.
Just moving away from that, there's a good question from Nick about major projects that have a reputation for being late and over budget. What is the industry culture that allows this issue to carry on? And is there any fix to this?
Yeah, look, I mean, it probably comes back to, the PDRI. I mean, we can look at what the actual question is, but if I look at a major project, it's not just one thing that has the project go off. The way I sort of, if you look at the feedback we got around the different phases, from the sort of the scoping, the governance, what you actually find is that there's a perfect storm that gets created. And sometimes a perfect storm can get created right at the beginning, where, especially if it's a mega project, where what's really driving the mega project is the politics of the project. So you've got a sort of political agenda, which can actually influence the quality of the estimates. It can actually undermine the governance in some cases. So I think it's not just one thing. The project culture is a big piece, but I think it's actually the sort of the coming together with all those components. Now, if you look at each of those components, or all of those components, I mean, what's behind each of those components is human beings, right? And those human beings are doing one of three things. They've got a certain disposition. There's a certain way of being in each of those phases. There is a certain quality of dialogue which is taking place. And the quality of the dialogue itself could be shaped by fear, for example, if there's a political agenda taking place. So there's sort of like who they're being, the quality of the conversations that are taking place. But then there's also the sort of the rigor of action and the quality of output. So again, I think this may be a very long answer to a short question. For sure, project culture has a big play, but I think the culture is really, it starts to manifest itself fairly early on in the project, during the sort of the early phases. And I think you can see that if you look at if we were to revisit those bar charts, one of the things I would say is, we had, actually I can go back and we've got the project governance here, but you can also see in a way the weak business case and scope changes. These are two related areas, and this is sort of like an indicator of some of the dynamics and some of the things I've just been talking about. And of course, once you get beyond that, you've got these other two areas that also become more significant. Rob, any other questions we've got?
Yeah, we've got lots of questions and lots of thanks for sharing, and people are responding saying thank you, you're perfect, thank you. Potentially following on from that, Daniel has asked, in your experience, who is initiating the conversations around improving project performance? Are these client-led, contract-led, or driven collaboratively by both parties?
I mean, again, it's a great question. I mean, we tend to work mostly with clients, just purely from a power structure. It's easy to work with them. But we've worked with a large number of tier one contractors in the past where they've come in and said, look, we're just in a very, very difficult contract. And can you kind of work with us and the client? And the clients have been open to that. And we've been, if I look at the last couple of years, we've actually had some very large subcontractors also approach us. So it's unusual for a subcontractor to approach it. It generally tends to be from the client end. But if you've got a very large project and there's a lot of money at stake, then the main contractors tend to be fairly open to this.
Great, thank you. So Kay's asked, just for a bit of clarification, during your presentation you mentioned about pulling some people out of a project. Is that removing them from the project or diverting their attention to other areas of the project? Would you mind clarifying?
Yeah, well, I think it's, I don't think there's an easy answer to that. If I look at it, I mean, I think there's a number of different ways people have, projects have done it. I've seen projects where if the senior leadership is part of the toxicity of the project and they're really getting in the way of sort of the delivery of it, and they're kind of adamant. I mean, I've seen situations where project directors have been removed. I've also seen projects where you've got someone that's been put in a position, and they've been put into a position simply because the organization doesn't really have anybody else in their demographics to be able to elevate. So they've been put into that position, and they really just need support. And sometimes it's a question, you know, it could be a case of maybe moving them to a previous role that they're really good at, you know, and sort of supporting that, and maybe bringing in a new person to kind of take on the role above. So, you know, that could be another model. As I said before, I mean, I generally don't like people to lose their jobs, and you know, it's not something that we advocate. You know, it's not a decision that we sort of promote. You know, it's ultimately always down to the client what they do. You know, so I tend to look at it from, is it a capability gap? Is it a mindset gap? You know, and is there a willingness for the teams to be, you know, are they asking for support, for instance? And if it's a very large job, the thing that you find is that in some countries, you know, from where I work, there just isn't anyone, you know, locally able to, or even has the track record of a project of that size. So especially with these very, very large mega projects, you're actually dealing with one-off jobs. Some of them have never been done before. And so you're bound to be hitting a lot of unknowns. And so you know, very often you do find that there's a capability gap between even the best people in the market and what the actual project demands of them.
Thank you for the clarification. That's great. Someone's requested it. When you get brought in to turn around a project, what is the first thing you think about or want to know?
The first thing I'm looking at is, what are the sets of concerns that the different parties have? So, and those concerns in some cases are kind of obvious. I mean, there's, if you like, concerns that are expressed in the project review documents. And, you know, given that I've got this graphic up, you can think of it as concerns in sort of performance metrics, all of this, which is down at the bottom right. But as we start to get related to the team members, what they often start to share are some of their own personal concerns about their ability to fulfill on the roles that they've been given. And you know, and very often people start to, you know, also highlight some of the cultural issues that are there, things that they don't feel comfortable about, but they feel like that, you know, it's really sort of pervading the whole space of the project, and really nobody's dealing with it. It's sort of there. People are going through the motions. It's like the elephant in the room that, you know, everybody's scared of addressing, but nobody's really got that sort of, you know, they're just too concerned about bringing it up in case they get shot down or, you know, they're seen in a negative way. So it really, it comes, you know, it really starts with a set of concerns that are there, and then.
Great, thank you. There's been a question with regards to your book, and when is that likely to be published or made available?
Sure, I'm targeting that for probably late Q2, between Q2 and Q3.
Perfect. Hope everyone keeps an eye out for that, and obviously reach out to Vip on LinkedIn, etc., to find out more.
You want me to watch it as well?
A good question from Mick, and I can see a theme within other people's questions as well, so I'll try my best to collaborate them. Can you discuss some methods to influence the leadership team from within the project? Negative behaviours and key individuals that move the goalposts and block initiatives, or on the side of that, also when you get a team that has some negative individuals, how you overcome that?
Yeah, look, I think this is a very, very, I mean, I'm just coming back to this slide that I showed you a bit before. Let me just come back to this. Look, I think, you know, I mean, I think it's a really tough spot to be able to be working a project where your own leadership team is the constraint. One thing I would say is, um, is to look at the quality of the relationship you have with them. And you know, and a lot of that comes down to how scared you are of the leaders themselves. You know, because some guys, as we know in projects, can be fairly scary at the top. If the leadership team is open, I mean, one way to do it at a very practical level is to, you know, just say something along the lines of, look, you know, I've got some observations. Would you be interested in, you know, would you be open to you know, me sharing about X, Y, and Z? Because I think it would, you know, would help impact the delivery of the project. So if you can create an opening like that. The other thing you can do is if you've got someone else that you're working with that has that's got the listening of the people at the top, that would be another sort of strategy to you know, to kind of, especially if they're aligned with what you're thinking. So that could create an opening in the conversation with the people above, right? So that's another, you know, that's a tactical thing I would do. You know, if I look at from my experience, very often, I mean, about 90% of the projects I've worked on have been ones where it looks like they're about to go into trouble or they're in deep trouble already, right? In the oil and gas space, when I worked, especially with Chevron and BP in the past, where the projects are so large, I mean, you'd have leadership teams there being very, very savvy about the people side. And so, you know, in those kind of organizations, you'd actually have a proactive approach to the, if you like, the other three quadrants of this model right up front. And because they know that the whole project hinges on people, it's nothing, you know, that's really where it's happening or it's not happening.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'm conscious of time, so we've got a couple minutes left. I think it'd be good to share this. It's more of a comment than a question, just to round this up. So this comment says, my team was called in to turn a project around recently. We eventually had a major cost overrun. And this person says, thanks to this webinar, I have a sense of what we didn't do too well. So it's really good that this webinar has happened, and it's given people the opportunity to learn and share some knowledge, which is great. There are certainly like 5 or 6 other questions, Vip, but if you don't mind, what I'll do is I'll send you these post-webinar, and if you've got the time, it's okay.
Yeah, absolutely, no problem. And you know, and look, if any of you do want to follow up, I know some of you probably may do. What I've got up here is a whole number of ways in which you can connect with me. And one is obviously you've got the email addresses there, and then you've also got my social media. So please reach out on LinkedIn, or I'm also got a web page at INSEAD, which has a whole article on it's called Overcoming the Misery of Mega Projects. So if you want to have a look at that, you can also use that as a resource.
That's great, thank you, Vip. But we'll leave that on for a couple more seconds so people can make a note of those and reach out to you in the future. Personally, I'd like to say thank you, and on behalf of the APM, for you giving up your time to join us. I know there's more messages coming through saying thanks for the interesting session. A big thank you. So we've had over 230 people join us today. So I know that it's been well received by the project management community as well. So thank you for that. I'd let everyone know that the APM are running additional webinars as well. So keep an eye on our website for future events, and we look forward to meeting everyone there. So Vip, thank you, and we'll speak to you very soon.
That's great, Rob. A real pleasure. And thank you, everyone, for taking a morning off and listening to the webinar.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone, and keep well. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.